Good morning, everyone. This morning we're joined by Corey Fields, Associate Professor and Idle Family Term Chair in our Department of Sociology. And Corey, it's wonderful to be with you. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. And let's jump right in. I'd like to start by asking you about sociology more broadly. What drew you to this field? What excites you when you think about your own academic journey?
Yeah, so how did I get into sociology? God, that's like a long question to have, and a good one to have to think about. How did I end up here? Well, so after undergrad, I worked in the private sector for like 6 years in, corporations, doing sort of market research work, right? And so in some ways, I was really interested in like learning about people and studying them and understanding them. But the thing with the private sector work is you only got to work on a project for as long as a client was willing to pay for it, right? So like the moment a client was like, we know what we want to know, we're done. And I would be like, wait, I'm still interested in this. Like, there's more I want to know. I want to ask more questions. And so, I was thinking through what are ways that I can sort of pursue my interests in the social world, sort of more directed around sort of what I wanted to study. And so academia seemed like a good pathway, right? A way sort of, people sort of doing research and grounded in empirical data. And so when I was thinking about particular fields, sociology really spoke to me, partly because it had this nice balance of sort of theoretical motivations or sort of like big questions in terms of like how society worked, but there was a lot of grounding of it in empirical detail, right? Like sort of like cases, like specific cases. So it felt like this nice balance of sort of broader knowledge, yet tied to specific cases. So that's, I ended up applying to grad schools and got into a great one. And yeah, here I am.
Well, tell us a little bit more about the perspective that sociology as a discipline provides when we look at the issues that you're focused on: identity, culture, experience. What are the tools or ways of thinking that sociology offers as we seek to deepen our understanding of the world and our human experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for me, when I think about what sociology brings to the table, I mean, what I like about, I think it grapples with big questions and small questions, right? And so if, I teach in my social theory class, I say, sociology is trying to answer the question of how is society possible, right? And that's a total easy question to figure out and answer. But what I like about sociology is that it grapples those big questions, but more often than not, it's grounded in a sort of smaller level understanding, right? Questions like, what is religion? What happens when people move from the city to the country? How do we form our identities, right? Sociology provides a framework for understanding various empirical phenomena. So I think about sociology as, a discipline that's really tapped into trying to explain how the world works. So it's well equipped to help us grapple with the questions that animate our local communities, right? But at the same time, gives us ways of thinking about broader units like, society or the nation, right? So it sort of helps us tackle these sort of bigger questions, but those answers come through our examination of sort of smaller, more lived experience. So I really like how sociology is grounded in the empirical world. Like the department here at Georgetown, for instance, we have people doing stuff on like neighborhood, urban gardening, Chinese ideas about happiness, Black Republicans, right? And those are all very specific cases, but we're all linking our work to sort of broader principles, right? That are sort of bigger than the case. And so sociology, I feel like, gives you a nice give and take with that.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's a good segue to my next question for you, which is, last summer you became a principal investigator for the American Voices Project, a national study and household survey initiative that seeks to understand how Americans are doing. And your study focused specifically on differences in how Americans talked about the protests last summer over police violence and racial injustice and the pandemic of COVID-19. Can you share more about this study and some of what you have found?
Yeah, I'd love to. So, right. So the past year, right, has been, we've all been sort of had our lives completely sort of uprooted and changed and shifted around. And we've all been dealing with a lot of new stuff, right? Part of which for me was, I had this ongoing research project that pretty much, it was a sort of ethnographic study of advertising agencies. And it pretty much had to come to a halt because of COVID, right? So it was like, people weren't at work anymore, so there was no work for me to observe. And it happened that I also got invited in to be a PI on the American Voices Project, which you mentioned, which is this nationally representative interview study. And so the goal of the project is to make this interview data publicly available to all researchers, right? So you know how there's sort of survey data that gets published widely. So something like Pew or the General Social Survey, and this is data that any researcher can download and use in their own analysis. Well, we're trying to do a version of that with interview data, something that's sort of more qualitative. And so we've been in the field for a little over a year. We started out going door to door, right, with the team of researchers, but now we've obviously switched to phone interviews and Zoom interviews like, everybody else, right? And it's been really exciting. And in some ways, being able to be on the pulse of what's happening right now and talking to people, right, about it. Because, we read stories in newspapers and magazines and sort of, social media things, and you get sort of a broad perspective, but it's not necessarily representative, right? And it's certainly not deep. And so what we've been able to do with the American Voices Project is talk to people about their lives. The interviews open up with the question that's like something to the effect of, tell me about your life. Right? And then people just start talking, right? And it's like, hours long interviews that become available. And so what I've been doing so far is working on two reports. One that looks at how people are talking about their experiences of COVID-19, and the other one is looking at how people are talking about the sort of police protests around police violence that happened last summer. And what's interesting about both of those projects, or in what we're seeing in the data, is this fascinating thing where it's like, we're all experiencing the same thing, but talking about it in very different ways. And so what I like to think about, it's sort of saying the particular is as important as the general, right? So it's like, we're all going through it, right? But we're going through it in different ways. And one axis in which we're finding a lot of difference is, along the lines of race and ethnicity, right? In terms of like the experience of the pandemic. So it's like, everybody's talking about their lives being reordered as a result of the COVID pandemic. But the way that, Latino respondents, African-American respondents, and just lesser than Asian American respondents are talking about it is very much focused in on sort of challenges to material well-being and health, right? There's this sort of in the household kind of concern, right? So people are sort of expressing, I'm worried about COVID coming into my house because I have to work, or because, my sister got it, and so now I can't hang out with her, kind of thing, right? And it's interesting because that sort of, it hits differently when our white respondents are talking about their COVID experiences. Their lives have certainly been reordered, but it's along the what they interview in the interviews, what they talk about is more sort of experiential things. So working from home, right? And so it's like, well, now I have an entire household here all at the same time, and we're trying to figure out how to manage that. And we had to up our internet bandwidth, and I'm so annoyed with my partner screwing up my Netflix queue, right? Like, and the thing, and what's fascinating, right, is that it's some of these problems are shared across all respondents, right? But what's been really interesting is to see, that some people are talking very clearly about the sort of health and material concerns, whereas other people are not sort of focused on, there's no sort of job law. The job is there, it's just now you're doing it from home. So in some ways it's sort of like, I don't mean to minimize it, but it's sort of the inconvenience of the pandemic versus deep disruption
Sure.
with the pandemic, right? And so what's great about the American Voices Project is it allows us to see how people's stories are kind of interrelated, right? So you can sort of see how people are talking sort of about talking about the same thing, but in very different ways. But those different stories do piece together to give you a picture of what's happening in America. So, so it's been really exciting to work on that. And, like I said, we're sort of looking at a range of issues with it.
Well, incredible time for you to take on this responsibility. That's
Yeah.
fantastic. Now, 5 years ago, you wrote a piece for the New York Times during the 2016 election titled "What Black Republicans Care About," with insights about the nature of African American political affiliation and perspectives within the Republican Party. And that same year, you released a book with expanded insights on the topic and the associations of race and political behavior. Could you highlight some of the key ideas that you explored in your writings?
Yeah, of course, right. And so, so this was my, the sort of my first book project that kind of took up similar issues, but in a different way, right? Thinking about sort of the relationship between identity and politics, right? And so that sort of aspect of social life. And one of the things I sort of really I found in sort of the empirical data, talking to Black Republicans, going to Black Republican events, right? Interviewing Republican leadership across different kinds of states. And, I talked to people in red states, blue states, swing states to sort of see how political context inform the experience of what it's like to be Black in the Republican Party. And I think, a few things stand out, right? So at like an individual level, I think it's really important to understand that, everyone who has a shared identity doesn't always feel the same way about it, right? So it's not enough to know that someone sort of hand raises or identifies as Black. You need to know what that means to them. So in terms of trying to understand the relationship between identity and politics, it's not enough to just know that the presence or absence of the identity. You need to focus in on the meaning and importance of the identity, right? And so that's, sort of when thinking through identity and politics, sort of as a scholar kind of insight. But more broadly, I think, the one of the takeaways was the experience of being, Black and Republican in some ways points to a broader experience about moving through spaces as, a minority, right, in some ways. And so in a lot of ways, the story I tell is a story about Black Republicans, but it actually speaks to a broader experience of like, what is it like to navigate a context where there are not a lot of people like you? And, I've actually, I wrote a piece for American Media, a Jesuit publication, around like thinking through how can I apply some of the insights in Black Republicans to other kinds of institutions, right? And so one of them was this idea of, to be successful within an organization requires managing your identity in a way that sits with the organizational goals. So if you're the Republican Party and you want more Black people involved, right, you're only going to get the kind of Black people that you welcome in some ways, right? So it's like, if you only make space for, a certain kind of Black Republican, that's the only kind of Black Republican you'll get. And so that was another, sort of powerful insight, that Black Republicans themselves aren't a monolithic group, but their experiences are often conditioned on the sort of broader, organizational demands, right, that are sort of placed upon them. And I think that's something that points to a lesson other organizations can learn from, right? Like, especially organizations that are thinking about, diversity and inclusion, right? Are you creating the kind of atmosphere that allows that to flourish? So it was a very fun and exciting project, and one that, it sort of pushed me to have to think differently about some of the stuff that I thought, right? Like, I sort of got into it, not because I was sort of really into politics or like a political thinker, right? Like, I sort of ended up doing the project because I was studying knitting groups, and I was studying this group of young women who knit. And I got interested in this idea of unexpectedness, people who do things you don't expect them to do. And an advisor suggested that I think about a comparison group. What's another group of unexpected people And on the spot, I was like, well, it's like Black people who are Republican. You don't expect it. And then I thought about it and I was like, you know what? No one's actually really done any good work on this. So yeah, the next thing you know, I had a book about it.
And the New York Times review of your book, they wrote, and let me quote, though we tend to think about the ways in which race and myriad other forms of identity shape politics, you show that the current runs both ways. Close quote. Can you share more about this idea, about how you see the relationship between race, identity, and politics? And how should we think about these issues now, especially in the aftermath of the insurrection that took place here at the US Capitol on January 6th?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, and it's funny that you asked this because this is something my race and politics seminar this semester, we've been spending a lot of time talking about, the sort of relationship between identity and politics. And oftentimes we think about sort of, identity drives political behavior. So it's sort of like, tell me your identity and I can guess your politics kind of thing. But what we don't often consider is how the inverse is also true, right? It's sort of more of a reciprocal relation. So politics structures the way we think about our identities, right? So, and in some ways, in very literal sense, right? So we can think about the census, right? In some ways, it's a political tool, right? Like sort of negotiations around what questions get asked, how they get asked. These are sort of oftentimes political questions, right? But if the census adds a category, right, it sort of says like, oh, now this is a legitimate identity, right? So like this, so the addition of like the ability to sort of describe yourself as multiracial on the census went a long way towards creating people who could sort of understand themselves as being multiracial, right? Like this is now this sort of category of identity that's been legitimated by politics. And so, people can point to what percentage of people are like me now, right? And so we can think of that sort of identity growing out of politics, right? In regards to the stuff I was doing on Black Republicans, sort of there was a similar dynamic in terms of like, the way that Black people within the Republican Party were able to talk about being Black was partly conditioned on what white Republicans wanted to hear, right? And sort of like how white Republicans wanted to use Black Republicans to make a political point, right? And so that sort of politics structures how they get to talk about and understand their identity. So I just think more broadly, we can look at this and linking it to our current political moment, right? In terms of like the extent to which, sort of political actors, politicians, think tanks, organizations have sort of mobilized and played upon various identities, right, that are now animating people. So people are kind of like, yes, this identity is meaningful and people are talking about it. And now I'm going to act on behalf of it. And then next thing you know, right, it's like it's mobilized for insurrection or, in the parallel way, it might get mobilized for positive politics, right? Like I wouldn't be surprised if we saw, a lot of organizing around sort of like Asian identity in the US, right? Given sort of the current political moment with the increase in hate crimes and attacks. I suspect that we'll see, sort of organizing in resistance to that kind of thing that often will get structured around identity. So politics can make identity in the same way that identity can make politics.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. You've taught one of our Ignatius seminars for first-year students in the Georgetown College. It was titled Blackness as an Organizing Strategy, which explored the experiences of African Americans in the development and impact of post-1960s US social movements. Can you talk a little bit about the seminar and how it further draws on and connects with the focus of your scholarship?
Yeah, of course. You're asking me about like all my favorite things, man. This is like a cakewalk. Oh, the Ignatius seminar, it's been such an amazing experience. I mean, I taught it for a couple years in a row now, and every time there's just such high level of engagement with the material, engagement with the ideas, and engagement with each other. It really is a sort of environment where we're learning about one another at the same time that we're learning about the world. And I feel like I'm often hearing new things on, ideas that I think I have well in hand and well sort of comprehend. It's like a student will come in and say something and I'll be like, you know what, this has me thinking differently about stuff, right? Like not just what we're talking about, but even linking to my broader sort of research agenda. So it's a fun way to get students engaged with thinking about, the role historically that Black political activism has played in the US and how that gets drawn on by other groups, right? And in terms of thinking through sort of the seminar and how it's like impacted my own ideas and work as a scholar, which is one of the amazing things about it. And Georgetown, more generally, like you get to connect your teaching to your scholarship in this back and forth way. The seminar has actually provided an awesome opportunity for amazing research assistants. So one of the other projects I've taken up this past summer has been a study of organizational statements around COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter, looking at Fortune 500 public statements about these issues. And the two research assistants on that are students who took my Ignatius seminar. So Caitlin Frazier, Nikhil Cole, hey, what's up? They're amazing research assistants, and they brought, fresh energy and ideas to this project. And I absolutely think that's, grounded in the experience we had together in the seminar. So the Ignatius seminar, it's a great program and I've had an amazing experience with it and hope to keep teaching it as long as they'll have me.
Well, Corey, thank you. And thank you for sharing your reflections with us today. In closing, is there a message that you'd like to share with our university community?
I guess when I think about it, it's like, the thing that's really helped me manage, what's been a crazy year is leaning on each other, right? And I feel like, as someone who's relatively new to Georgetown, I feel like the sense of Hoya community really came through over this past year. And I feel like in some ways it's turned me into a bit of a booster about it. And so I guess what I would share is lean on each other. Like we're there for each other. And, you don't hesitate to reach out if you need help, or reach out if you have help to give, right? I feel like this is a great time to take stock of, the community that you have around you and to lean on one another. So I guess that's what I would say. I don't know, it's maybe a little hokey, but it's certainly sincere.
Beautiful, that's beautiful. Thank you. And again, thank you for taking the time to share your insights and your work with us today. And thank you for all that you do to contribute to our community.
No, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
And I look forward to being with all of you again soon. So take care of yourselves and take care of everyone around you. For every Hoya, everywhere.